All right, we'll get started, and thank you guys all for joining us today. Today, we're excited to have our clinical trials conference series, which is a joint venture between GlomCon and NephCure. And today's talk is titled Drug Development for All Ages. So before we get started, I'd like to just mention our partnership with NephCure, where their mission is to accelerate research for effective treatments for rare forms of nephrotic syndrome and provide educational and support that to improve lives of those affected by protein spilling kidney disease. And one of their excellent resources they have is this Kidney Health Gateway, where there is a portal where you can go online and look to see whether you're a patient, a physician, a family member, see what clinical trials are going on that may fit your disease and a location. So with that, we'll introduce our speakers. We're very excited today to have Dr. Howard Trachtman and Dr. Debbie Gipson speak with us. Dr. Trachtman is an adjunct professor of pediatrics at the University of Michigan. He's been the principal investigator for the NIDDK and industry-sponsored clinical trials for pediatric and adult patients with glomerular diseases. He's on the board of directors for the Kidney Health Initiative. Dr. Debbie Gipson is the director of Pediatric Glomerular Disease Clinic and Pediatric Nephrology Clinical and Translational Research Program at the University of Michigan and principal investigator of the Kidney Research Network, CureGN, Pediatric and Clinical Trials Programs with Neptune, and Prepare NS Studies. She is the co-PI of the TNF Precision Medicine Trial with Dr. Trachtman and lead investigator for the Neptune Match, and provides glomerular consultation for clinical trial design for adults and children with glomerular diseases. Today, Kristen Hood, the Executive Director of Research Engagement from NephCure Kidney International, will be joining me to moderate at the end of the session. So I will stop my screen sharing. We'll turn it over to you guys. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us.
Good morning. I think on behalf of Debbie and I really want to thank all of you for giving us this opportunity. This is work very dear to our heart, and to have the opportunity to speak with people as committed as all of you to the improvement of the health of patients of all ages with glomerular disease, and letting us talk to you about children is really just a treat, even on and it's a freezing cold Sunday morning anyway, so nobody's running outside to the park. So we want to divide the time, and we want to make sure that we leave really ample time for you to have an open conversation, because I think that's the most important thing. Everything that we will present is available in other formats. The key thing is to be able to put our minds together and to talk to one another and find out how to work better together to achieve this really important goal. What we want to discuss, we're talking about pediatric trials in glomerular disease. We're talking about it for all ages, with the understanding that we want to make sure that children are included in all of those ages. And we want to start off by talking about what's happening out there, some recent successes. Failures is a tough word, I think, but disappointments might be a better word, and some challenges, by highlighting current experience, ongoing experience with the Duplex, Protect, and Epic trials that are being sponsored by Travere, the recent experience with bardoxolone, which is being tested in a disease that's very important in pediatrics, and then trying to learn a little bit from the work that recent accomplishment with avacopan in the treatment of adults with ANCA-associated vasculitis and its relevance to children, and how it's actually being leveraged, how people are trying to move from adults to pediatric circumstances. Duplex, as you know, is the ongoing study that's being done, that's being sponsored by Travere, looking at FSGS. This is interesting. This is a success. I think this is a clinical success. In other words, I think it's the largest randomized clinical trial that has been done in FSGS. They randomized 371 patients, and this is through really the very, very beginning, the very dire period of time at the onset of the pandemic. An enormous number of sites studying the entire globe, and the enrollment occurred over about 2.5 years. Again, as I say, COVID was towards the latter third of the enrollment period. So this is a credit to all of the people. Interestingly, despite the fact that Duet, which was the phase 2 trial testing sparsentan in FSGS, which was open to pediatric patients, and the age range was 8 to 75. Duplex was not. But again, this is an important milestone, the fact that the community of nephrologists around the world, adult nephrologists were able to successfully recruit this number of patients in a really quite a reasonable time frame. Is really a feather in the cap to the entire community, and it does provide impetus to expand into the pediatric population as well. And I'll show you that actually is being done. In a parallel manner, Protect, which is a very analogous study that's being done for IgA nephropathy. It's also a very, very encouraging finding. As we all know, that the literature we've been beating ourselves for at least a decade now at how low the rank is of nephrology compared to other disciplines in the completion of adequately powered randomized clinical trials. And Protect and Duplex are, I think, beginning to reverse that trend. So this is a study. The Protect was a study that had a similar onset, beginning of the study at the very, very end of 2018. And in fact, middle part of last year, May 2021, 404 patients were enrolled. So they exceeded their planned sample size again, recruiting again through the heart of COVID. Very, very broad representation around the world, North America, Europe, and Asia. And both studies are extremely pragmatic in their design. They're enrolling patients with FSGS without central review of the biopsy, reachable enrollment criteria, GFR greater than 30, protein to creatinine ratio greater than 1. Similarly, in IgA, GFR greater than 30, protein creatinine ratio greater than 0.75. No requirement for central review of biopsies, which is often a substantial logistical issue. Both of them, the endpoint, at least in the short term for accelerated approval, is based on the change in proteinuria, and then with a long-term out in FSGS based on the GFR outcome. But it's extremely heartening that these ambitious studies can buck the trend and show that the nephrology community can work together with patients with the skill and the expertise of coordinators and all of the ancillary staff at all of the participating sites to successfully recruit patients in a timely manner. Because again, the longer studies go, again, the less valid they may be because changes in pattern of care and biases in the nature of the patients that are enrolled. How does this reflect on what's happening in children? So this is to report to you on the EPIC trial, which is Travere's attempt to sort of fill the gap in learning about the impact of sparsentan in children and adolescents with the diseases that they're studying in adults: FSGS and treatment-resistant minimal change, IgA nephropathy and IgA vasculitis or HSP vasculitis, and the disease that's important in pediatrics, Alport syndrome. And this is an open label phase 2 study with a long-term treatment period. It's over 2 years, similar to Duplex. And the sample size is modest, 57 patients. And ostensibly the idea would be that to show comparable data in adults and pediatrics to enable regulatory approval across the lifespan. It's interesting. This is important also, that this is what we would now call a basket trial, that the thought behind the design of this trial, this sparsentan being at the top, and then these 3 baskets being poised underneath the sparsentan: FSGS, IgA nephropathy, and Alport syndrome, that they all are presumed to have a shared injury pathway that would lend themselves to be amenable to being helped by the administration of sparsentan. So again, this is a movement, and Debbie's going to try to flesh this out in greater detail, how nephrologists are trying, all of us clinical nephrologists across the board are trying to modify the way we do clinical trials to make them more responsive and more efficient to get these potential therapies to the bedside. Again, this study has been taken up very energetically by the pediatric community, and the enrollment is proceeding very, very briskly. And again, I think that this is one of the things that I'm learning, is that success breeds success, and the following the footsteps of the really monumental achievement in the adult community to conduct the duplex and protect trials is providing the impetus to push sparsentan across the lifespan and enable us and nephrologists to ascertain, is this a drug that's useful, that should be incorporated into the care of patients with either FSGS, IgA nephropathy, and now port syndrome in the management of their disease. What about bardoxolone? What about what I would call a disappointment? This is the study that you're probably all familiar with. This is the Cardinal trial, which was, again, a 2-year randomized controlled clinical trial with patients with Alport syndrome. And the mean age of these patients, I think, was you can see it, to me, it's young, probably comparable to everybody on the call, but for me, it's young, 36. But interestingly, there was a reasonable pediatric participation. 15% of the patients were adolescent. And you've probably been aware of the reports of the phase 3 trial over the course in abstracts that have been presented at national and international meetings over the last couple of years. And the data did seem to suggest that the patients that were on bardoxolone had a steady increase in their GFR over the course of time that was persistent even during a washout period. However, despite this very, very promising data, at the end of last year, the Cardiovascular and Renal Drugs Advisory Committee denied approval for this drug, raising concerns about the safety. And this is, I don't think that this should be viewed as a complete failure. Hopefully this will prompt people to try to refine and to figure out how to better assess the biological impact and the potential adverse effects so that we can flesh out the story, because the data were promising. It was a difficult decision that the FDA had to come to, and it was far from unanimous, and that means that there's still much to be mined from this potential mechanism. Again, as you're probably all familiar, that the community has learned a lot. Nearly 20 years ago, when the Beacon trial was first published, that described the increase in GFR, there was this concern of hyperfiltration and diabetic nephropathy. The community refined it, was able to tease out the patients that were at high risk of this complication, and potentially the same kind of basic science and translational research can be applied to the data that's been accrued in the Cardinal trial to allow people to thoughtfully move forward and try to refine and discern which subset or under which circumstances bardoxolone might be a suitable treatment for patients with Alport syndrome. Again, recognizing that, as you know, for virtually every single glomerular disease that we're talking about, there are no FDA-approved therapies, and we need to try our best to have reasonable criteria to advance therapies to the patient bedside. Let me give you an example of something where we think, Debbie and I think, that there's been movement, but in a different pathway. This is the paper, this is the summary slide from the report from David Jane and the wonderful collaborative group on vasculitides. And they reported this, I think, in May of last year in the New England Journal, showing that the introduction of I'm not sure if I say avacopan, I think other people may say avacopan. Pick your accent, put your accent wherever you prefer. And you can see that the introduction of avacopan into the treatment regimen, enabling a reduction in the dose of prednisone, was associated with a reduction in the relapse rate over the course of the period. It wasn't clear-cut over the entire period, but there was clearly a beneficial effect over the course of time. And I think the drug has been approved for the use in adults. Now, that being said, ANCA-associated vasculitis is not a common disease. However, in pediatrics, we do see this in most tertiary care centers. Debbie, in her experience, when she was at University of North Carolina, she was often the go-to person for people around the United States who had questions of children and adolescents that they were treating because of the profound expertise that was located in Chapel Hill. And the next slide shows that, in fact, the FDA has approved the use of rituximab for the treatment of both GPA and MPA, the two prevalent forms of ANCA-associated vasculitis. And in this circumstance, the approval was based on a small study with 25 patients in which the key outcome was documenting that the safety profile in pediatric patients was comparable to what's observed in adults. Knowing that the efficacy had been documented in adults and there was supportive data in pediatrics, the FDA therefore felt justified in extrapolating the data from the adult to the pediatric population and approving rituximab for the treatment of children and adolescents with this rare condition. So again, it demonstrates the different pathways that drugs can be approved for the use in the pediatric population. The second topic that we want to present to you is efforts that are being done to promote this important effort to allow trials to be done that are designed expressly with the inclusion of pediatric patients, and to then partner with industry to make sure that the drugs are being introduced into clinical trials under this framework with pediatric patients being included. One is the effort of the KHI. This is the Kidney Health Initiative. This is an initiative that was undertaken by the ASN. It's a partnership between nephrologists, industry representatives from industry, and the FDA. So it gets all of the key relevant parties. It doesn't have, they're patient advocates as well, but these are the people that are involved really in the putting together the protocols that hopefully with the inclusion of the patient voice, but the effort to get them together to identify areas of need and to figure out ways to facilitate and expedite the conduct of clinical trials with appropriate endpoints for all diseases. And there is a pediatric working group. And one of the major activities of this working group is to develop consensus statements that delineate what's known about the natural history, gaps in that knowledge, identification of suitable measurements to follow and to clarify what the clinical course of a patient is, what are suitable trial endpoints so that clinical trials can be effectively designed and implemented in real time. There's an excellent paper that was published, I think in 2020, on hyperoxaluria, which is predominantly a pediatric disease. There's an almost completed manuscript on FSGS talking about eGFR and proteinuria as potential surrogate endpoints, and projects that are getting underway are in C3 glomerulopathy, an extremely rare glomerular disease that affects both children and adults, and a study that Debbie and I hopefully will be undertaking soon to expand a previous publication where KHI, under the leadership of Elisa Thompson and Patrick Nachman, wrote a paper on designing endpoints for IgA nephropathy in adults and to extend this into pediatrics. An ongoing activity is where the KHI is hopefully pulling together the key stakeholders in the community, both in the United States and in Europe, to identify key priority issues that would be primed for the conduct of randomized clinical trials in an effort to husband people's resources and to address timely issues that the community thinks are really, really very urgent, that as a community we can work together to supplement all the work that's being done in all of the other different venues. Another effort that has emerged is a program called Connect for Children. This is a European multinational network that's designed to facilitate the development of new drugs and other therapies for the entire pediatric population and for the entire spectrum of diseases, not just nephrology. And it's a partnership between academia and private and industry. And you can see there are a number of partners in Europe. And the effort is to develop a sustained platform that can define drug development processes, procedures that can be shared between trialists, industry, and regulatory agencies. So people are starting from the same point in time and in space, so that they're not reduplicating effort and people are all talking in the same language. And they're trying to create an organization and an infrastructure to bring this to bear. And again, this is reflecting of the globalization of research. We know this from all of the drug sponsors that are conducting the trials really around the globe. We in nephrology, as the investigator part of the tripod, it's helpful to get together, and we're working with colleagues in Europe who are part of this effort and trying to bridge, and I'll show you that momentarily. So finally, another effort that has been developed to promote clinical trials, especially in pediatrics, the Kidney Research Network, which is a vehicle that Debbie has assembled, and I'm going to let her describe it because she should take all the credit for putting this all together.
This is actually an outshoot. And again, the question that comes to us today to center us is, what are our relevant questions and problems that we're seeing in a pediatric population is part of our conversation, but also in an adult population. And in our world of GlomCon and glomerular diseases, we really are focusing on typically glomerular diseases, which are proteinuric kidney diseases. The Kidney Research Network is a US-based program that includes some international partners as well, with the goal to try to de-risk essentially the development of clinical trials and the identification of new therapies. So I would ask the question, what are the key problems and barriers to help us to move forward? And part of the issues in the United States is that we have data in a variety of places and formats. And so we ask the question, how do we best actually aggregate data in order to be able to use that information to help us to understand better natural history, help to validate outcomes, help to identify populations. It gathers up a clinical trials network, which includes both academic and community practices at national and international venues, as well as adult and pediatric focused practices to try to help to be certain that we have an infrastructure able to conduct clinical trials across the lifespan. There's a clinical trials consulting unit as part of this to help to be certain that individuals, whether they be in an academic setting or in a private sector setting, who are interested in conducting a clinical trial or developing one, have a nice entry point to be able to identify individual expertise that may help to fill in the gaps, right? None of us can do this by ourselves. We're always looking for a little bit of help. So the clinical trials consulting unit helps to identify individuals with the requisite expertise to help to make sure the clinical trials are of high quality. There's an outcome consortium that helps us to identify, develop, and validate clinical trial outcomes. And then quality initiatives, right? Bringing back the information of discovery where we're finding challenges in population, even in care delivery. So we're using the same data that helps us to anchor and develop clinical trials, use the same data to help to be certain that we're actually providing high quality care to our patient population by understanding simple things like how often is actually in our population blood pressure controlled? Right? How well are we doing in providing that into, for example, a quality improvement initiative to be certain that we're making sure our population has the best standards of care that we can provide while teeing them up to be able to participate in clinical trials where our standards of care are not yet adequate. Next slide.
Okay, that's.
And I should just give a shout out that this the Kidney Research Network has its underpinnings in a partnership with Nephrology, Kidney International. So it had a previous name, and they provided, which is a fantastic partnership to help to get the Nephrology Accelerating Cures Institutes up and running. And then as it moved forward in time, it's become a Kidney Research Network with a variety of other sponsorship, but fantastic initiation of that program.
Thanks, Deb. And I'm going to introduce another program that Deb and I have been trying to push with, again, with the help of Josh Tarnoff and people from NephCure. We've called this Pioneer, and this is a small group of pediatric nephrologists here in the United States in collaboration with colleagues in Europe, Marina Vivarelli in Rome, Elena Levchenko in Louvain, and June O in, I think, Berlin, correct me if I'm wrong. And we've developed this group called Pioneer, which is really The goal of Pioneer is specifically to try our best to facilitate the design and the implementation of trials that would include children. And this is a figure from a paper, from a manuscript that we were fortunate enough to get published in Kidney International. And we've identified these 6 areas that we think would be, that we can work together to try to improve in an effort to increase the participation of pediatric patients. One is to interacting with the regulatory agencies so that they need our input. The FDA, the EMA, they want our input to define the natural history of the diseases, what we know about the current therapies, so that what we know about the toxicity of current therapies and other models, so that they can be thoughtful arbiters of what we know to help us reach thoughtful and safe regulatory decisions. To collaborate, we're obviously committed to doing this and to create uniformity across both sides of the Atlantic and in Europe. We've recently added a colleague, Eugene Chu, in Hong Kong. So the broader the representation, the more likely it is that we'll be able to speak a common language, that we'll be able to identify shared problems and shared resources that can enable people to work together, implement trials with a broader geographical and clinical scopes, that they have greater likelihood of success and a greater likelihood of representing the global population affected by the disease. Providing support for sites. One of them, and I think this is something that we hope to, when we discuss this as a group, how do we make sure that investigators like yourselves, I'm old, but people that are young, that are building their careers, how do we provide support for you to conduct this vital part of what we think is what makes careers in nephrology so exciting? How do you get support for that? And also, how do you get recognition for that? On the other side, we want to make sure that the trial designs are meaningful, they're current, they reflect the tremendous advances in biostatistics, and even in the philosophy of clinical trials and incorporating new knowledge, adaptive designs, smart designs. There's expertise around the globe. There are people at Michigan that Deb and I work with, platform and basket trials, which are becoming part of the normal parlance as people talk about clinical trials. Incorporation of the patient voice, knowing that the trial is addressing concerns that patients have, following up on the SONG initiative, making sure that the trial endpoints are valid, making sure that the measurements are valid, making sure that the burden to the patients is not just tolerable, but actually acceptable, that they want to be part of this, and ensure, most importantly, making sure that we have age-specific clinical trial outcomes. Children, adolescents, young adults, middle-aged adults, older adults like myself, we all have different perspectives, what should be appropriate outcomes, and making sure that all of this is taken into account. And Deb will go from here. Thanks.
So we're going to just take the next few minutes to be a little bit practical about those next steps. When we're developing a pediatric investigation plan, there are key considerations that need to be articulated, not just sort of considered, in your own head, I like to say, but actually written down and to make sure that it's clarified. And through that writing, the clarification occurs. This outline for pediatric investigation planning is a work of the Pioneer team in partnership with the Food and Drug Administration, with some interaction with EMA, the European FDA equivalent as well. The A section is taken off of here, and the outline, it's the executive summary. So I'm just going to march through this really quickly. When articulating a pediatric investigation plan, right, considering what you want to do, this is adolescent, but it's really a child justification document. So you're going to ask yourself the question, what is the objective? What is your main question or problem that you're trying to solve by testing the clinical trial, testing a test agent in order to move the field forward? So what's your objective? The second is essentially, what are your data sources? Be clear about what you have available so that you know what data you have and then what data you do not have, what your gaps are. Be open and transparent with yourself, but also with others as you move forward. And sometimes in the midst of that clarification, you say, I don't have it yet. And so you go and find more friends and more data sources, or do a little bit of analytic work to actually make sure that you have the foundation necessary for a pediatric investigation plan. So we look at clinical trial data sets, observational studies, real world data, anything that we need to try to help to be certain that we can clarify essentially the need of the therapy development. We ask ourselves the question of the natural history of the disease in section C in children, adolescents, and adults. This becomes incredibly important. This is an example using FSGS, but it becomes important to do that because it helps you to say, is it appropriate to have a clinical trial that crosses all ages or certain subsets of ages, right? You want to understand that, what are your best outcomes you have to think about, but at what time are those outcomes experienced in the life of the patient population subgroups, to ask the question, does your design need for pediatric investigation planning a little bit of a different design for children or adolescents or adults, or can you put them all together and keep your study design to be very harmonious because the natural history is consistent? And so again, only data will help you to understand that. So you do an overview of the diagnosis, if your example diagnosis, an overview of the outcomes as experienced in standard of care. We use natural history, but it's in standard of care. We ask ourselves a question, and obviously glomerular diseases, what's kidney survival, patient survival, but from in a patient voice perspective, also what's their health related quality of life. We think about that very disease oriented. What are the endpoints, not just the survival endpoints, but what are the surrogate or intermediate endpoints that actually make those clinical trials doable in essentially a reasonable time period? It makes drug development, it makes clinical trials possible because we use endpoints that are intermediate endpoints. But if you're using those and proposing those, you have to be able to also show the relationship between that intermediate endpoint and the hard clinical endpoints to be certain people feel comfortable that the surrogate is actually taking you towards essentially a truly efficacious drug. And then obviously we summarize each of those pieces. We then look at the sort of standard of care safety summary. And from our perspective, especially in rare diseases, this becomes incredibly important that we articulate that to the best of our ability. What's happening in the current world of care? What are those outcomes, right, in our current standards? Because that's essentially the framework upon which we're going to bring up the comparison of safety, right, for our new therapies. So we want to bring that together to be able to understand, what does better look like? What's our goal? And then you're going to look at essentially, again, the therapy associated safeties as well. Then you're going to use an overview of the drug or biologic project. So, what it is that you're going to test, your test agent, you want that overview. And that overview needs to include things like adolescent or pediatric safety. So juvenile toxicity studies are important when you're doing investigation plans for children. Those may be in other documents that you could just point to and then summarize here, and you're going to reference well, and that's perfectly fine. But you do want to make sure that you're thinking about that from a safety perspective as you're proposing a pediatric investigation plan. And then an overview of the planned essentially extrapolation. So if you know, as referred to before by Howard, if there's effectiveness demonstrated in an adult population, and the natural history of the disease, right, the way the disease impacts patients in a pediatric or adolescent patients is the same as adults, then proposing an extrapolation study may actually be a very efficient way to test a new therapy in children and move it on into the approvable space where sort of prescribing can actually commence. Next slide. In addition, then, you can do a summary of the non-clinical and clinical study. So everything that's been done already in the field using the test agent and the patient population. If the test agent is actually a me-too agent, I like to call it, so other drugs in class have been tested and approved, then you may use and refer to those other studies as well in this, but you want to be certain to be very clear about what's in the agent that you're proposing, as opposed to what I would like to say is its cousins in class. So you'll do a summary of the non-clinical benefits, prospective benefits, and clinical data that help you to think about the prospective benefit. And then you use non-clinical safety and clinical safety data to help you to understand the potential risk, right, and the tolerability of that risk. You'll look at the pediatric formulation and dose. If you're looking at an adult or an adolescent population, right, and you're looking at a pill easy. If you're going to think about in developing therapies that are going all the way down to infants and toddlers, and it's an oral formulation, you got to get it into a formulation that those infants and toddlers can consume. So you have to actually have a liquid formulation. An example of that is the EPIC trial, which is now testing a liquid formulation of sparsentan that allows those drugs to be accessible to small children who frankly can't swallow a pill, right? Those are simple and practical things, but you've got to get that in here, and how you're going to formulate the drug, what it's going to be, excipient or carrier types of components of that therapy is going to be incredibly important. And what's the safety of that excipient, right? Historically, there are a lot of drugs that were actually made liquid and stabilized in an alcohol-based formula. Right now, you think about, oh, wait a minute. So you can imagine that an alcohol, a very strong alcohol base of a liquid preparation of a medication that you had to administer several times a day to an infant, right, or a toddler. You're thinking, wait a minute, how many shots am I giving this child a day? That's ridiculous, right? But that's the kind of really practical considerations you have to have. Any planned juvenile non-clinical or toxicity studies, right? Anything that's been completed, obviously you've summarized in G, but anything that you still need to do, then you just want to, again, articulate that. I recognize I don't have this part yet, so I'm doing it. And you want to put that early on in the state and in your pediatric planning to make sure that you can do some concurrent work here. And then any planned pediatric clinical studies, including pharmacokinetic studies, does that little body actually metabolize a drug differently than an adult body? You need to be able to demonstrate that. That's often the piece that's actually demonstrated in the extrapolation studies. Clinical efficacy and safety studies, what are your plans? And then your plan study design and implementation, including those pediatric considerations. So special considerations for endpoints, special considerations for timeline, special considerations for subset analysis, right? If you're going to do an adult, adolescent, and child all in the same trial, you may ask yourself the question, you know, is one analysis sufficient, or do I need to pre-specify some subgroup analysis to be certain? And do I need to hold patients longer to really demonstrate prolonged efficacy in a population that continues to be a developing human type population? You got to write down your own timeline. It's actually a commitment to yourself. It's a commitment to others. How long is it going to take me to get through this pediatric investigation study so that we're certain that we're meeting what I would say is, to the best of our ability, commitments to our patient and family communities. And then if you're using a global trial planning, of course, you've got regulatory authorities in each of those countries. So you have to make sure that you're in lockstep with those. And sometimes different countries have different regulatory sort of opinions about a clinical trial. And you have to incorporate those opinions into your pediatric investigation plan to make sure you're developing trials that have the potential to be approved in multiple countries as well. So if the patients are participating, we want them to have the future, if things go well, to be able to actually access those medications once the trials are complete. Next slide. Howard, can you move that forward? There you go. So methodology support is important. You think, boy, there was a lot of that outline. How are we going to do that, right? Find your friends, right? And so to a degree, Howard has provided an overview of resources to help, right? Resources to help. In glomerular disease, we can oftentimes include minors and adults in common clinical trials, but as individuals, we may not have all of that requisite expertise. So calling in friends that are already organized to help in this way can be incredibly important. So can help in identification of the trial design options that are available and maybe a best fit. Identifying gaps in natural history that actually can be analyzed and fill in those gaps. Oftentimes we don't have to restart a new prospective observational study. We just have to leverage the data that are already in people's hands and in their data archives. We develop endpoints and we validate those endpoints so that we know where the strengths of those endpoints and where they should be positioned in our clinical trial design. And when we don't have the right endpoints that are present, then we have to develop them, right? And that sometimes we just have to do that. We have to understand that the development and validation of endpoints are part of the work that we do collaboratively. And then finally, we think really hard about just, we do a lot of single trial stop single trial stop, but we've matured in the world of nephrology and glomerular disease where we're finding ourselves doing multiple trials simultaneously. And some of those trials are sort of locked together because it's the same agent, but we can do also some of that sort of locking and loading, preparation and conduct in a trials platform that can help us to be much more efficient. Go ahead and move to the next slide. I'm going to just bounce these slides about 30 seconds at a time. Neptune, which is a rare disease NIH-sponsored study, is essentially working hard to identify the pathways that are part of the diseases that we are considering in the midst of glomerular diseases, and actually trying to understand the molecular pathways that are present in those diseases, and then identifying druggable targets to be able to not only think about sort of therapy development and implementation. And our ultimate goal is really to get to the right trial for the right patient at the right time. Go ahead and move forward. So Neptune Match includes both patients and physicians in that essentially understanding that if we can understand essentially a biosignature that's in a patient population that helps us to understand what the mechanisms are in play in their kidney disease, we can match that biosignature with essentially the drug mechanisms of trials that are in the field. So Neptune Match essentially generates a report based on patients' biosignatures and their strength of their biosignature matched to clinical trial drug mechanisms, and provides that report to patients and ultimately to their primary nephrologist as well, so that they have the information, understanding it has a big old "this is research" label on it, but they have some of the same information that we've all been generating for many years and can then use that as they'd like to help them to decide about a clinical trial that may be a best fit for them. Next slide. Trials platforms we referred to just a little bit ago, and we know that there are basket trials and there are umbrella trials and there are trials that we can sort of stack together with common and different mechanisms, and that organization of trials becomes an incredibly important component of what I consider to be our current and future state for clinical trials in glomerular diseases, because there are so many trials, and that's a wonderful thing to say, which we could not say 10 years ago. Next slide. So there are active trials in glomerular disease for children right now, and thank you so much to NephCure for tracking the trials that are in Gateway. Recognize, please, that not all trials possible are actually in the Gateway program. So if you're looking for trials and you're not quite finding them, going to resources like clinicaltrials.gov become important to make sure that you see them all. But these particular clinical trials, with gentle modification, Kristen, to add on for one gap that we did see, includes these trials. So the EPIC trial, the DUPLEX, which enrollment is complete, the Valiant trial, which is an Apellis trial, and then there's some other trials that the Lipizorbal, which is not a clinical trial, but it's a sort of an extended access, I'm going to call availability, which is labeled here, and then the TNF inhibitor precision medicine trial. These trials are available to children today, right? There are trials that are coming up that will be available to children, you know, in the next month and the next 2 months. And we're always looking for ways to be able to say children that follow adults in the same trial. So you have a staggered cohort opening. So I enroll an adult cohort with some established efficacy safety. We bring up a pediatric cohort, or we may have adults trials that are followed by pediatric trials, so kind of a 1-2 staggered implementation of clinical trials. And sometimes we do pediatric trials alone because the disease is really in children and not really in adults. And so the dominant population is in children. And so our trials are actually really only focused on children. And all of those are possible. But you'll understand the majority of trials are actually loaded up for adults. And that's because essentially from a regulatory perspective, our regulatory agencies, they have been historically very comfortable having trials of novel agents go into adults who can self-consent and decide about whether they want to be in a trial or not, and then can decide from that if they get an efficacy and safety signal, then can move on down to a pediatric age group. Sometimes that's appropriate, and actually sometimes it's not. Because if we have no therapies for children and we have no therapies for adults, sometimes essentially the staggering of patient populations, especially if you know that you have a good, safe juvenile toxicity and you have, for reasons you feel like you have a really safe agent and the regulatory agencies believe you have sufficient data, sometimes bringing that new drug right into a pediatric population, even without significant adult population data, is a perfectly reasonable approach. And we can help you to try to find good trial designs to make that work. that's our last slide. Oh, shoo. But the discussion becomes incredibly important. So we'll be quiet, and Kristen, we'll let you just facilitate any conversations or questions from you.
Thanks so much. This was great. I'm curious if we consider, obviously what COVID has done, and especially with in relation to clinical trials and the access for pediatrics to get the COVID vaccines. I'm curious if there are some takeaways or points from that we can, consider in trial design and the access for pediatrics in glomerular disease. And I'm curious if you have some thoughts on that. And I'll just open it up to either of you.
I think COVID has, I'll go first, maybe you can follow up, tell me if I've left anything out, but I think it has changed the landscape considerably. The trials that succeeded during the last 2 years are the ones that showed flexibility and were dynamic in their response to how the world was changing around them. And I think that the message that's gotten out is that trials can be made more efficient and more accessible to patients and less disruptive to their lives, so that home visits, being more thoughtful about what are the time points that require central laboratory assessment, and bringing the study more to the patient, helicopter hovering of the trial over the patient, rather than making the patient come to the center. And I think this is something that I think it's going to be incorporated into clinical trial design moving forward, because there's no reason to go backwards, to go from a place where we've made it more efficient for patients, predominantly driven by safety concerns, but it worked. And therefore, even in a safer world, post-pandemic, why not be more respectful of patients' commitment to time? For children, it's missing school, it's babysitters. For adults, it's missing work, and all of these aspects that are monumental logistical hurdles that patients have to, with their commitment, that they have to overcome. And it's a testament to their will. These are things that clearly can, that I think will be incorporated 100% and maintained into thoughtful clinical trial design. And if we're not doing it, we're going to hear it from the patients.
The only other thing I would say is, of course, the decentralized trial model implementation becomes incredibly important for children as well as adults. So where possible, to be able to leverage home health nursing types of facilities that are trained to help to conduct the clinical trials, that can actually help to conduct the visits, that incorporates essentially the expertise of the trialist, the nephrologist investigator, and the research team, and the what I'm going to call is the traditional academic or nephrology practice hub becomes important. And then the use of Zoom or other platforms to help to be certain that there's good oversight. Those decentralized models make clinical trials much more available to children, just like adults. They help to actually diminish some of the exposures, right? As we've thought about sort of exposures, of our patients have said, I don't want to go to an academic healthcare system. I don't want to sort of be close to people too often if I don't have to. And these are ways to actually bring the trials to the patients wherever they are. And so those are possible for both, for trials across the lifespan. I mean, had been in the field and other fields outside of nephrology for many, many years. And so nephrology has just been coming more into the implementation of this decentralized trial conduct model, which actually works quite nicely.
Yeah, so for my next question or discussion topic, I kind of want to combine the first bullet point here and the third one, to be honest with you. And the reason why I'm curious, because, you know, around the management of children and adolescents in clinical trials, at NephCure, we are obviously huge proponents, obviously, of pediatric inclusion and really diversifying clinical trial inclusion overall, right? But within the pediatric population, it is not uncommon for us to talk to pediatric caregivers who are extremely interested in clinical trials. And it's not uncommon for them to have to either get on a plane and fly for 2 hours or 3 hours, or get in a car and literally drive 7 hours, especially during the COVID pandemic, when flying was really like not
Yeah.
encouraged from anyone, right?
Yeah, sure.
So, and, on top of that, where they would go is an adult nephrologist. So the PI of the trial was an adult nephrologist. So I'm kind of curious on your take on, on the expansion of getting pediatric nephrologists more involved in clinical trials to be able to manage these pediatric and adolescent, participants. And, and what does that look like as far as career progression, right? Like, so I feel like these are very related. And is there any incentive, and what can we do as far as getting more pediatric nephrologists involved?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I'm going to sort of take the first, and I'll give Howard the second for this one. First of
I
all, there are actually a lot of pediatric nephrologists who are part of clinical trials.
Yes.
The key issue is that pediatric nephrologists actually take care of patients in glomerular disease. They take care of patients in, inherited, diseases, in chronic kidney disease overall. They take care of dialysis and transplant. And so subspecialization within nephrology, to be perfectly honest with you, is oftentimes sort of an academic pursuit, but the pediatric programs are not so big that they have sort of subsections of their division. And so sometimes it's really just a bandwidth issue, and they can't do them all. They can't do trials in primary hyperoxaluria and hypertension and dialysis and anemia. It just becomes an overwhelming structure. There are a couple of things to be able to do. So, part of it for us is to be certain in a GlomCon environment that we're including pediatric nephrologists and sort of bringing forward the enthusiasm and the opportunities for career development, for actually being part of work that actually makes a true difference in the lives of patients. And to a degree, making things easy, right? Easiest as possible, the development of clinical trials that include essentially nephrologists in their design can be incredibly helpful up front, right? Why? Because it's a career development opportunity. I not only conducted the trial, but I helped to design it. I was on a steering committee. I'm part of publications. I can communicate that within my organizational structure, and they say, oh yes, right? You get credit, I call it the triple dip, right? You get credit for your sort of own academic progression. You get credit for making a difference for essentially patients in the future. You get credit for actually serving a care delivery mission in your local environment. So all three of those happen simultaneously, right? That's a fantastic thing. So I think success breeds success. I think we also have to make it easy for people, right? We have to make it easy. So to design a trial that is very inclusive, add-on trials, being considerate for the things that actually are unnecessary barriers for actually effective and efficient trial implementation, initiation, and conduct, learning those lessons and actually broadly applying them. Being generous with sharing those lessons, right? It's not wise for us in pediatrics or adult medicine. It doesn't really matter the age group. If we have identified a barrier in a trial design and said that one is a real problem and we have learned to get rid of it, let's get rid of it universally, right? Not just, in the special 5% of folks who figured it out. So having that collective sort of resources, shared learning, a shared intention for quality actually makes a huge difference, to be perfectly honest with you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that I think the shared, oh, sorry, go ahead, Howard.
No, you go ahead, and I'll just two other thoughts. You go first.
Okay. I was going to say, the shared learning is really an important part. I feel like, honestly, I think the adult nephrology world could really learn from pediatrics in the sense that, at NephCure right now, a lot of our government legislation and policy initiatives are really around, improving diagnosis, right? So quicker access to diagnostics and access to disease experts. I feel like in the pediatric world, especially with my experience, and I would say like almost everyone as a pediatric caregiver to a child with a rare kidney disease, I would tell you that, the specialist was in our ER room within 1 hour of the lab work being drawn. So how, right? So if you think about the perspective of the increased access to nephrology sooner in the disease journey, I feel like there's a lot that can be learned, because we know that earlier interventions in kidney disease overall can improve and decrease the progressive nature of disease, as well as, improve access to treatments. Obviously clinical trials we feel should be incorporated into any treatment outline from a physician. But I'm curious, as far as what have we learned, going down to that last bullet, what about the international perspective? GlomCon is global. We have international colleagues here on the line today. What have we learned internationally about pediatric inclusion, or what is some of that shared information?
I would welcome the input of all the people on the call, because I think we have a very, very broad participation. What I would say is our sense in our conversations with our colleagues in Europe is that our experiences are not unique. Cultures are different, countries are different, the way the healthcare is organized is unique, the patients are different, but the difficulties that you described, Kristen, are fairly universal. And I think that the fact what Debbie described, the sense that pediatric nephrology divisions tend to be smaller, the smaller dialysis population, and the workload, even though there are fewer patients, I'm not sure whether we spend more time per patient, but there's very little meat on the bone for people. They're really, most of my colleagues, I think, are really working very, very hard, and the amount of time that they have available. The two thoughts that I would have, and I'd welcome whether my international colleagues would agree. One is I would try, I think of this wonderful book, The Emperor of All Maladies by Siddhartha Mukherjee about cancer. And he describes how in the 1940s, when Mary Lasker decided that she was going to support research for cancer, and nobody knew what they were doing at that time. And they just stumbled on the Jimmy Fund. They had that child in Boston, and there's a wonderful paper in C. Jason describing how the patients and their care prescribers feel that they suffer from an unsexy disease. And how can we promote ourselves better? How can we find that Jimmy Fund for pediatric nephrology, for nephrology overall? Because it's hard to turn your eyes away from a sick child. How do we leverage that? The other thing I feel, and I wonder whether the people on the participating in this would agree, is I strongly believe that doing clinical trials is work. It's hard work. It requires commitment. It requires a lot of support staff. You need quality coordinators. You need quality lab people. Your schedulers have to be flexible. Everybody has to be part of this. And I wonder whether the time has come to create centers of excellence, that places would get recognition as places where clinical research is done with skill and with dispatch by quality people, so that the institution can share in the enterprise and the glory, so to speak, I use that, of being part of this effort, so that the investigator is not like standing there all alone on an island and looking for funding, looking for support, looking for recognition, that the institution has buy-in because they are labeled as a center, a go-to center, that we are a place, we have all of the requisite personnel, all of the requisite facilities, the equipment, the backup, the Ronald McDonald House where you can stay overnight, and you can just get clinical research done effectively and competently.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Josh Tarnoff, the CEO of NephCure, has his hand raised. Josh, would you like to talk?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll take that down. One of the things you're concerned about, the practical concerns for these trials, and I think one of the issues is that within the pharmaceutical industry, it's just not part of the playbook to start with children, right? And the reality is it doesn't take much early on. I think the plea is to maybe post this and send it to our colleagues in industry, to plead with them to please get the pediatric toxicology and safety data early. Don't do it sequentially, because the reality is if you have that by the time you get to phase 2, you literally can double the enrollment of your trial. I mean, right now we're only getting about 1.2 patients per site. And so if you double that by adding a child, you just decreased your cost dramatically, and you've done something good for everyone. So I think it's just a matter of getting the players. And so if we have these wonderful networks like Pioneer and these other initiatives that Debbie and Howard are involved with, please, if there's some way to get to the pharma industry to say, look, this backbone is here, they just need to put it's relatively not that expensive, by the way, to put that early in their program. I think that's a real gate item that if we could focus on, it would make a big difference.
The other piece of this is also, and I think we've learned a little bit more from our European colleagues, and the Connect for Children is actually part of their sort of implementation of their lessons learned, which is to be organized, but also to be organized very much with a mind and a heart to ask the question, where are the biggest problems? Where are our priorities? And then we're going to lean in with our voices and our presence, right? And essentially, from the beginning and to the end of, therapy development in such a way to be able to say, we're going to really focus on our biggest problems. And some of that conversation is really not only the biggest problems, but that are ready to be solved. So sometimes we have big problems, but the foundational work, there's not a therapy that's ready to be tested, right? Quite frankly, there's a therapy that's ready to be tested, but maybe the safety, the early safety signals make us say that maybe not ready for prime time. It may need to go back to do a little medicinal chemistry work to actually get to, a better sort of expected safety profile. There's some real work that can be done that comes not only from enrolling patients efficiently, but I think, and conducting your juvenile tox studies early, these are important things. But part of it also is to say, what are our highest priorities? And let's sort of make sure we have a bit of a group will and then a group voice to both advocate, to educate, and to participate in those activities. And I think that's, we're learning that along with our European colleagues that there's some value there. And I think we can do that around pediatric drug development. I think we can do that around glomerular disease drug development. So it, across the lifespan. So, but I think that focused attention can be really fantastic. And I'm gonna go back just a momentary to say, and people can actually build careers in this space that actually gives them a sheer value and that is valued, if you will, in their organizational structure. So there are ways to actually communicate this to your boss, right? To your organizational structure. There's a way to build your CV. There's a way to sort of see a career progression. But most important for us, that's all important because we want high quality people to come and learn and get stronger and to stay in the professional world. But also, more important, we want to be sort of looking at essentially our patient population that's affected by disease and say, in this year, their care and their treatment options are better, they're safer, they're more tolerated, they're more effective. And we really need to charge ourselves to ask the question, is the work that we're doing having an impact on the patient population?
Thank you, Debbie. And I think one key point that you harped on again, and for my personally as being a program director for an adult nephrology program, where we have some med peds nephrology fellows and, mentoring and education, some of the pediatric nephrology fellows, I think, Howard presented an excellent overview of the resources that are out there and what we can do as we're training nephrologists, both adult and pediatric. And as you guys well know, the training is different in what's required of research time, but using those and combining our strategies together to learn from our pediatric colleagues and pediatric trainees as adults, to have them, then we can be involved in that. They can be involved with us. So that, as Kristen said, when a patient is going to be enrolled in a trial, they feel like they're part of a team that's ready to care for them, whether they're whatever age they may be. I think is hugely important. So with that, if you guys have any last comments, we're about out of time, and appreciate really all that you've shared with us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, likewise. And they have our emails. People should feel free to send follow-up questions. The conversation shouldn't end just right at 12:07. I think Eastern Daylight Time, right? And I apologize for any confusion if people weren't able to get on. I feel bad. Take care. Have a great day, everybody.
We will post the video to the YouTube channel. We'll make sure we put it in the announcement for sure. And if you did just join, there's a link on the email announcements that says to check your time. So please be sure to do that going forward.
Take
Thank
care.
you all.
Thank you. Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.
you.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
Bye now.